Okay, good morning again. Good to see you back. Sorry, in the last class, what we did on Monday was to look at the whole syllabus. So I won't repeat all that today, of course, but hopefully you know the basic outline of what the course is about, yeah, from the description. If you would like to discuss afterwards, I can show you the syllabus in more detail, yeah. So what we decided to do today was having set out a number of issues, just to summarize some of those key questions, again, especially for those who've just come. The study of disasters is interesting for all sorts of reasons, right? One is the impact that it has obviously on human life and human societies. And the point we tried to stress quite a lot last class was that in addition to looking at disaster management, prevention, recovery from more technical points of view, from in terms of engineering, for example, okay, it's also important to look at it from cultural and sociological points of view. Processes of prevention, processes of recovery, the psychology of reaction to extreme events, for example, okay, and the way in which sociologically people cope through creating new forms of community and so on. So that was basically what we were setting out last class, okay? So what we decided to do today was to look at a number of cases of disaster situations to see what we could learn very specifically from those cases, okay, in terms of illustrating the kind of points we were talking about on Monday, okay? So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some cases and we're going to see what issues arise from them that we should debate. And many of those we'll come back to in much more detail over the next month, okay? But to get the picture going, okay? All right. Let's take a range of examples that have a different basis in the kind of disaster we're talking about. And let's start with something, of course, tragically familiar in Japan, which is the earthquake and tsunami related. And I'm sure you know this, right? It's quite, it probably seems quite a long time ago to you. In 2004, there was a very large undersea earthquake off the coast of Indonesia, right? Of roughly the same strength as the one that occurred off Fukushima, right? A 9-point something, caused an enormous tsunami. And this had enormous impact on countries on both sides of the Pacific, actually. On the eastern side, of course, Indonesia, which is the closest country. Thailand, parts of Thailand were badly hit, okay? And also, of course, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, particularly Sri Lanka, was badly damaged. And parts of the southeastern coast of India were also badly affected, okay? So when we look at this particular case, are you familiar with this case? You know a little bit about it. I mean, you must have heard about it, I assume. You know, the damage that it did. It's considered now one of the great classic cases of this kind of disaster, right? What lessons were learned from this in terms of both prevention and recovery? Okay, well, I've listed some of the major ones here. At the time of the 2004 tsunami, there was no early warning system in existence, okay? There is now, but it doesn't work very well, okay? Part of that early warning system was decided to anchor, you know what a buoy is, the floating, what do you call it? I don't know what the Japanese word is for a buoy. That floats on the surface of the water. Often they're used for navigation purposes in harbors. They're anchored, of course, to the sea bottom. Otherwise, they will float away, okay? Was to set up a network of buoys in the Indian Ocean, relatively close to coastlines, so that in the event of a similar event happening, there would be at least some warning for people. How long the period of warning would be. Unfortunately, a number of these buoys were created. They are there, but in many cases, they don't work. Unfortunately, the Indonesian government hasn't put a lot of money or resources into creating an accurate early warning system, so far as you can, okay? That's an interesting question, because the question is, what do you do when you get a warning? Does it still happen in Japan? When I lived in Tokyo at the UN, sometimes my keitai would buzz, and you'd get this warning that there was an early warning of an expected earthquake. But the question is, what do you do? How do you react to that? What do you do? Do you run out of the building? Do you hide under the doorway or under the table? What do? You know something's probably going to happen, but how you defend yourself from it is quite a difficult question, right? Okay. The case of the tsunami-related thing, of course, so you have the two events, of course. You have the effect of the earthquake itself, right? Very substantial damage. But then most attention is actually being devoted to the tsunami itself. Now, the one thing you can probably do in the case of a tsunami is to get to higher land as quickly as possible. Move inland, right, and find some elevated place. There's not much else you can really do, right? But at least if you have some warning, that is a possibility. Secondly, lack of sea defenses. But the problem with tsunami is, of course, they exceed the normal storm surge you get even with a typhoon or major storm. I mean, you could to some extent build defenses. They don't even work. When was it? It was 2 years ago, in fact, that Kansai airport was out of action. It was flooded. There was for two reasons. One was there was a very major typhoon, which and it's I don't know how high above sea level the artificial island actually, right, with the airport, right. Compounded by the fact that a ship broke its moorings and drove down on the bridge which links the airport to the mainland, which meant you couldn't get off the island or you could get onto it, right, for some time until damage was done, repairs were done to the bridge. Okay, was an additional problem. You were stuck at the airport for 2 days or something because you couldn't leave. Okay. Sea defenses, therefore, are usually designed for regular storm, right? Not for extremely large events, right? And the question is, can you actually engineer anything suitable to prevent damage from tsunami? How high would your seawall have to be? It would be enormous, right? How many meters? And even that might or might not withstand the shock of this, right? In Aceh, sorry, I didn't put pictures on but you can pass this round. There's some interesting pictures of, this is what Aceh, the city in the northern part of Indonesia, looked like right after the tsunami. You've probably seen pictures of this kind, right? Where huge areas of the town effectively disappeared, right? Coastal settlements, of course, you pass it around if you like. Look at the pictures. All the subsequent pictures are also about Aceh. There are other examples too, right? If your economy is to some extent, or to a great extent, based on fishing, you need to live near the sea anyway, right? Okay, and there's a kind of interesting psychology there. I mean, if as you get richer and richer, if you do get richer and richer, I hope you will, right? You tend to do one of two things. You either tend to live in a higher apartment, what is sometimes called the penthouse. If you're an apartment block, it's the top floors which are considered the most valuable, most attractive, right? In disaster situation, whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not sure. Or people want to live near the coast, sea view. Your property will increase in value in many cases if you have a view of the ocean, right? Which means, of course, you're also vulnerable to any storm effects because of your choice of site for your house, for your dwelling. Okay, but clearly coastal communities exist in large numbers all over Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on, right? And if the economy is based on fishing, it's unlikely that people will be willing to move to what technical people would consider a safer environment, okay? Statistically, there's something interesting here. How often do you think about disaster? Do you go around worrying that your place is safe? You should live somewhere higher, you should move inland, you should not live near the mountain? Sometimes we do, not a lot probably. Most of us are rather casual in a way about the way we relate. We know there is always that possibility, but we live with the probability that it won't happen. Okay, so you can live in, say, quite vulnerable situation. We were talking yesterday about I remember when I was in a plane circling over Los Angeles. Looking down, you can see the San Andreas Fault from the air. It's just inland from Los Angeles. And people they have houses built right along the fault. So you would knowingly buy a property on an active earthquake fault. I'm not sure that's a good idea either, but clearly people do. I assume as making the judgment that the statistical probability is small. What was the last time Fujisan erupted? When was the last major eruption of Fujisan? Kyoto, you're fairly safe, right? Right, by the way. Tokyo is not. On a clear day, you can see Fujisan quite clearly from Tokyo, right? A high building, or I can't remember exactly. It was 1770 or something like this. You could check this out. It was some time ago. Okay. There are people who work on statistical theories that if the previous eruption was, let's say, 1400 and something, you have a maybe 300-year gap between major eruptions. So if that theory is true, don't buy an apartment in Tokyo, right? Because you're getting close to the date again when, in principle, if you follow this numerical model, that the next eruption might occur. Very unpredictable, of course, but in fact, the effects of that would be, of course, extremely devastating for Tokyo, right? I was there after the 2011 earthquake tsunami, and it was very interesting for at least two reasons. One was that it was eerie. There was nobody around. There were nobody in the streets, right? All the big lights, the neon advertising things in the areas like Shibuya were all closed down, right? And in fact, the government actually had a plan to evacuate Tokyo if the levels of radiation increased beyond a certain point. What would you do with 30 million people? Problem, right? In fact, it gave rise to, it seems that even in Kyoto at that time, you really couldn't find a hotel room because thousands and thousands of people had left the Tokyo area and moved as far away, possibly, to West Japan, as far as away they could get, including here and Okayama, way beyond here. What would you do with 30 million people? How would you feed them? Where would you keep them? If you use school, gymnasia, or community centers or something, it would be a massive problem, right? In fact, of course, it never occurred. But there was a plan that if the situation got very bad in terms of radiation, it would be necessary. In fact, there was a new word entered Japanese language at that time. You heard the word flyjin? Not gaijin, but flyjin. You never heard this word? This was a word that appeared around that time because it meant flights out of Japan were all full. Flights into Japan were almost empty. If you want to get a seat on a flight into Tokyo in 2011, it was very easy because nobody was coming. Okay, the flyjin was this idea that people were, if they could, they would actually even leave the country, get as far away as possible, right, and sit out the crisis. Because in the early days, of course, nobody knew quite what would happen. There was a possibility that the Daiichi plant would go into actual meltdown, which would have disastrous consequences for a huge area of the country, all right? But unfortunately, it's not solved yet, right? But it's not under control. So you've got things to do with defenses, and you've got to do with the fact that coastal communities are common when shipping, fishing, tourism, whatever is involved. Naturally, people are going to live in vulnerable locations. Building standards, meaning construction based on the possibility of disaster. Now, again, in Aceh, in many parts of Indonesia, but other parts of Southeast Asia, it's common to build above the ground. Maybe you think I can find a classical sort of traditional houses. That's not, you can't see this picture very well. I rather like this, which will defend you against flooding, probably, but not against, you know, a major flooding above 6 or 8 feet. In fact, traditionally in Southeast Asia, the space below the house is used for actually all sorts of useful purposes. It's used for storage. Sometimes you keep your cows or whatever down there, right? Or on a hot day, you could sit down there and shell your vegetables or whatever you want to do. It becomes actually a kind of communal space. You can park your car if you have one. You can do lots of things with underneath the house, right? It has limited protective effect, not against earthquake, of course. It'd probably be more vulnerable unless the reinforcement was very strong, right? Flooding, yes, but earthquake, probably not. Might be more vulnerable than a land-based building, though we're going to talk about those kind of architectural issues later on in the course. Building standards, and in fact, although people talk about this, do you think that on the whole, buildings like residential buildings or shops in Japan are really built to high standards of disaster prevention? I'm not sure they are. I mean, you just walk around the streets in the area, the little back street areas. I doubt that very many of those buildings are designed for high levels of resistance. In some cases, the resistance is natural. A wood frame building is relatively flexible, of course, in its movement, unlike, say, a brick construction, which fractures very easily. So there is a kind of natural resilience built into a lot of traditional housing in Japan. But I'm a little skeptical about really how strong most buildings would be. And if they were earthquake-proof, they may not be fireproof. Of course, that's the other problem with the wooden building. It absorbs shock, but it's vulnerable to fire. And as you may know, the great earthquake in 1923, the majority of deaths were not from the earthquake, they were from the fires. It broke out. In 1923 in Tokyo, presumably most buildings were wooden, and it was around lunchtime, right? People were cooking at home. It was a very bad combination of factors. So it was actually fire. That would probably be less an issue now, but it would still be there. Lack of social memory or sense of vulnerability. Something we talked about a little bit last time, notably, how long will it be before the memory of these things fades? When will people start building on the beach again? Thinking, well, you know, it happened, it's probably not going to happen again for another 200 years. You know, I won't be around then, it's probably fairly safe. Yeah. Do people retain long memories of these kind of events? They tend to fade. Within a generation, there's a memory of it. Oh yes, this happened, but it's not really something that would create the feeling in you that you should react to that situation, that vulnerability. You know, it's happened before. I don't think as humans we tend to think that way very much, do we? Memory's kind of short, very, very short, and sometimes very, very short. Actually, okay, quite traumatic events, people get over them quickly, and then that may not be a good thing in the sense that if you have a history of remembering previous events, okay, you can protect yourself against them to some extent, okay. Mind you, I've done stupid things myself. I remember going down inside a volcano in Indonesia. Indonesia is very volcanic. You climb up and you could go down into the crater to a certain point. Okay, and you find a local guide, well, knows the paths down inside. It's kind of, have you ever been inside a volcanic crater? Yeah? In fact, about 6 months later, that volcano erupted with very little warning. I thought, my goodness, that was the one. I was down inside there, you know, like 6 months ago, and you know, good job you weren't there on that day. Yeah, okay. Because seismically, there had not been much warning. The minor tremors were normal. Nobody really anticipated building to a major eruption. It's in Java, near the city of Bandung, which is in western part of Java, if you think of the map of Indonesia. Okay. Absence of refuges, places you could actually go and that would be stocked for emergency situations. Now, there are places that do this, but in fact, the cases where this normally happens tend to be in relation to war, not. I had a house once when I lived in the UK that still had in the garden the air raid shelter. There was some time during the war, the occupants then had built a concrete bunker, which was supposed to be strong enough to withstand a bombing attack. I don't think a direct hit probably wouldn't have worked, but if a bomb landed nearby, okay, you'd have been fairly safe inside. And I think at that time they kept it stocked with basic food, water, blankets, stuff like this. So if you needed the refuge, it was safe for a few days, right? But on the whole, this doesn't happen, I don't think, right? What you see in Japan are little signs directing you to a park or somewhere saying, evacuation area. You notice this? So find an open space, basically, where the danger of collapsing buildings or anything is minimized. But what do you do next when you're sitting in the park? Where do you go? Where do you go after the park, after the earthquake stops? Are there refuges, or in the case of coastal communities, places inland a little bit that would be stocked for this eventuality? Many governments don't want to do this because, of course, you might have to maintain a refuge for years without anybody ever using it. You'd have to change the food. You'd have to replenish the water supply frequently, this kind of stuff. All right. Inadequate national response plan. Now, as some of you know, I live in India at the moment, and the city of Mumbai, which is the kind of Osaka of India. I mean, Delhi is the kind of political capital, Mumbai is the kind of commercial capital, has been badly flooded 3 times in the last year. Okay, I mean, like waist-high water, so public transport stopped, slum dwellings and so on washed away or collapsed and so on. Very serious impact. The first time there was serious flooding in Mumbai, the government of the state in which Mumbai is found is called Maharashtra. The government of Maharashtra decided they had to have a disaster reaction plan. And they created a specialist committee, formed a plan. Do you think it's been implemented? Nothing's happened. The plan is there. You can read the plan. It's a wonderful plan. All sorts of ideas about simple things. Like in India, people tend to throw their trash into canals or, waterways, and they clog up. So in the event of extreme rain, there's nowhere for water to go, right? Often quite simple things like keep all the drains clean, make sure they're regularly clean so that there is runoff in the event of very heavy rain. In fact, nothing has been done to implement this. This is quite common phenomenon, actually, when there is really no plan about what to do in the event of a disaster, even one that you can, to some extent, anticipate. So if we look at the Indian Ocean case, you can see behind it a whole set of factors. Okay, some social, some more engineering factors, some political in the sense of the question of national responses. How ready is your government to respond to the possibility or even probability of a disaster of one kind or another? Okay. If we look at the other side, what happened afterwards? Well, we mentioned a few cases on Monday, right? People, in the case of the rebuilding, what people wanted was housing that was culturally appropriate. Okay. And that means that they wanted houses that look basically like their old houses. Okay. If you look at the ground plan of a typical Indonesian or Malaysian house, if this is, say, the front, if we have a fairly square house, you'll find several things. There's a veranda. The kitchen may be, right, and inside, of course, there will be rooms, and probably the toilet will be separated. Okay, and there may be some steps at the front. You can go up to the veranda. They're elevated above the ground. Yeah. Now, there are a number of reasons for this The elevations has to do with, it's good for storage. It also keeps your house cooler. You've got natural airflow, right? Okay, in a hot tropical climate. So elevated. The veranda at the front has multiple purposes. You know what I mean by a veranda? An open, a covered space at the front of the house. You can keep some chairs or sofa or something there, okay? Has several functions. One is it's where you socialize with people. You don't necessarily invite people into your house. You meet them on the veranda, the balcony, and you sit up there and you have your tea and talk and smoke or whatever, right? The reason you don't go into the house is this is also a gendered factor, okay? Women friends would go probably into the house or would congregate in the kitchen, okay? Men do not normally go into the private areas of the house, okay? So there's a whole cultural thing going on here. It has to do with the way in which space is distributed and the way in which space is gendered. Okay, so the veranda is primarily a male space for meeting your buddies, right? Gossiping, talking, you know, doing whatever out there, drinking coffee. Indonesians love coffee. But the women would be in the house or at the back of the kitchen. So again, you notice two things. One is that kitchens and toilets, sorry, that's my terrible spelling, right? Are often physically separated from the house. For reasons of hygiene and for reasons of safety. In the event of a fire breaking out in the kitchen, the most likely place, it's not going to damage the house itself, right? Whereas, of course, most of us now, we cook inside the house, okay? A different distribution of space. You know? You can do this culturally anywhere, by the way. If you just look at your own dwelling space or your family home or whatever, it's quite interesting to see how space is distributed and why it is, okay? And there are also other cultural factors involved. For example, have you ever been in the States, United States? Americans have this habit, which I find kind of charming in a way, but very un-Southeast Asian. They show you around the house. You know, you've met someone, you hardly know them, but you go there, you sit in there, they don't have a veranda, you probably sit in their living room, sitting room, whatever. They will show you the whole house. They show you the bedrooms, they show you the bathroom, they'll show you everywhere, right? Because they're very proud of their house, and it's quite okay. It's not the interior part of the house is not private, right? In most Southeast Asian cultures, it is. So you probably would not get into the inner parts of the house unless you were very close to the family, okay? So people wanted culturally appropriate housing rebuilt. They didn't want the kind of things that NGOs came up with, which looked like a little box, where everything was in a concrete structure with a tin roof, which is too hot anyway, and on the ground. Completely wrong, okay? So we were mentioning this before. In Sri Lanka, after the tsunami there, in many cases, people did not move into the new housing because they found it was too far from the beach. They were fishing people, and they didn't like it culturally. It didn't suit their expectations about internal relationships within the family and how space is divided up, okay? Culturally appropriate housing. People wanted to be resettled where their original house had stood. Now, do you think that's stupid? Say your house just got destroyed by a tsunami and you want to go and live in the same place, right? Say yes. Partly because, again, the statistical assumption that it's not likely to happen again, right, in the near future. It is unpredictable, right? And number two, because that's the place you have your memories and, you know, it's where I lived. Even on I don't know if you ever had this experience of moving house and finding the new house is better, it's bigger, it's nicer, but you miss the old one. For some time, you think, the old place was quite nice, you know, I kind of miss it, you know, it wasn't so bad, you know. Have you ever had that feeling? Think, why am I feeling like this? I mean, I have a better place, better, bigger, more modern, whatever it is you want, right? But you still have an attachment, particularly if the original house was, say, a family house, a house you'd grown up in, right? I was talking to a Japanese friend recently who, unfortunately, her parents have divorced. And the house they lived in, the whole of their life, in which she lived as a small child, they've sold the house because they've decided to have separate apartments. She said, I really miss this. I mean, I grew up there. It was my home. You know, you go back and look at it. You can't go in anymore. Somebody else is living there, right? And you'll see many, many cases of this. We're stressing this question of culture. A very interesting example of this, there is a very lovely movie. Of course, now the name I can't instantly remember. It's in Hindi. In 1947, India was partitioned. You know, a little bit of South Asian history into India and Pakistan. Yeah? And in fact, two parts of Pakistan. There's West Pakistan and there's East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. But originally, in 1947, Pakistan was a strange country because, you know, it had another country in between. You want to get from east to west, you have to cross India, right? Which is quite a big country, right? Okay. There's a wonderful movie which is about an elderly lady whose family migrates, a Muslim family, who chose to migrate to Pakistan. Pakistan is a Muslim, all right? Many Muslims left India to go to Pakistan, okay? Later they discovered they didn't really like it in Pakistan, okay? They wanted to go back to India. Their memories, their family had lived in India forever. They went back. But the policy was, at 1947, 1948, houses abandoned by people who left to go to Pakistan were given to refugees who came from Pakistan, right? So if you were Hindu or Sikh, for example, you know, the Indians the men tend to wear a turban, okay? The Sikh community. So, you know, you fled from Pakistan, you had to be housed, you were given the houses of people who'd left to go the other way, okay? The movie is about an elderly lady. The family returned to India because of all their memories and so on. And she's very old. She realizes she's dying. The one thing she wants to do before she dies is to go back to the house where she grew up, where she lived for like 80 years, all right? And it's a very touching movie because finally her sons and so on, they find who's living there, they go back, and she's taken back to the house. So very deep memories, you know, attachment to a place. So in a post-disaster situation, it might not be rational in a technical sense. You want to live by the beach again, you know? Say yes, because that's where I grew up, right? That is the space that I associate with my memories, okay? Resettlement patterns tended to follow the patterns of the old settlements insofar as possible. Some cases because of geographical shifts, the coastline having moved and so on because of the effect of tsunami and so on, you know, this was not possible, but wherever possible is what people wanted, okay? The role of religion. Now, we mentioned this again last week a little bit. Remember, we talked about this. What was the first building the people in Aceh wanted put up after the tsunami? The mosque. Yes, exactly, the mosque. They wanted their religious thing, not housing, not a community center or something, not a school. They wanted the mosque. Because, of course, it was through their religious beliefs that they were relating themselves to understanding what had happened. Okay? And I'm sure you'd find examples of that many other places as well, right? The depth of traditional local economy. It's not easy to shift your livelihood. If you've grown up as a fisherman and you've lost your house and boat, right? And somebody says, well, you don't want to go back to fishing. Why don't you become? Retrain, become a motor mechanic, or become a TV fix-it man, or become a farmer or something. I don't know anything about these things, right? And all my skills were related to the original fishing economy, okay? So in fact, in principle, it's easy to say to people, oh, you can retrain, right? It's not easy, psychologically or in any other way, actually, to retrain yourself when you have skills that you want to reestablish. So in other words, people want to live back by the coast, they want to get another boat, and they want to return to fishing as their primary livelihood, okay? It makes sense psychologically, I think. So the local economy and that relationship to sea and land. people talk about climate change and all these kind of issues. There's a question, how much of the Earth's surface is water? What percentage of the total globe is ocean?
70.
Sorry, did you have a figure?
70.
It's 71% is the last figure that I recently saw. So in fact, the majority of the Earth is water, right? And again, we often forget this in terms of this deep psychology. If you've grown up in a water-related community, the sea is not some alien thing out there, cold and wet. It's a place you understand very, very well. And I've seen examples of this. I did a project once in Fiji. It's a group of islands off, if you start from Australia, northeast of Australia in the Pacific. And I remember traveling by the local boat one day, going from one island to another. And it's a little scary in a way. Once you get out of sight of land, you're in the middle of the Pacific. It's big ocean, right? If you get lost, it's a long way to anywhere else. South America is like 2,000 miles, right, east of where you are. You know where you are. And with the high islands, you can see them. But the low islands, the so-called atolls, which are very close to sea level, the first thing you actually see are the palm trees. But you're out of sight of land. I remember being out of sight of land and saying to the boatman, said, "Do you know where we are?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, how can you tell? It doesn't have GPS. You know, any like high-tech thing like this." He put his hand in the water, took some seawater and tasted it. He said, no, we're about 10 miles. So how can you do it? He said, "Well, the water tastes different." And the second sign was you began to see birds. Okay, after about another 10 minutes, sure enough, you start to see some seagulls and so on, right? That's a pretty good sign you're getting close to land. Okay, after that, so then finally you see the palm trees appearing over the horizon. Think, how did you know? I said, "Well, the water." So I can't, you try this, go to the beach and try tasting the water and see if you can tell anything about it. In fact, if you can analyze it, it has to do with things like the level of sediment. If you're near a river mouth, for example, there are higher levels of silt in the water. Now, most of us could not detect that, right? If you're very experienced, if you know the ocean in that intimate way, you can tell. I know where I am because the water is different, right? The rest of us, it just looks like ocean, right? Nothing you can see, okay? So people often have that very intimate kind of relationships with either the land, if they're farmers, right? Or with the sea, if they're fishing people or engaged in some sort of maritime activity, which, we urban people have lost these skills completely. But they really exist. That was an example where I saw someone actually do this, right? In the Aceh case, there were other factors too. International interventions happened very quickly. That's to say, humanitarian NGOs in particular began to provide aid, emergency housing, tents, food, water. It's always a critical factor very quickly. And something which is quite useful is using your army. I mean, the Japanese army has not much to do, right? Fortunately, it was a good thing it doesn't have much to do, right? But, wasting their time. You may or may not know this, but the Self-Defense Force has a brigade which is a disaster response brigade. And I remember when I worked for the UN, visiting their base, it's in the suburbs. They may have several, I don't know. Right? There's a big base right next to the Uji campus, in fact. I don't know if that is what kind of division of Self-Defense Force it is. But anyway, and at the time I went there, half the brigade had gone, all right? They weren't on the base. They were in Haiti because the great earthquake had occurred in Haiti, and the Japanese government had immediately provided a brigade from the army for, reconstruction, rescue work, and, beginning the rehabilitation process. So, I mean, we'd see some of those things, I think, parallel with other examples. So let me keep an eye on time. We're all very familiar, obviously, with the 2011 tsunami here. And some of the factors, we say people like a lack of coastal defenses, and people like to live near the sea. I mean, the power station, of course, had nothing to do with the sea view, but people do like to live by the beach. I currently live in Delhi, and I grew up by the sea, and one of the things I don't like about Delhi is that it's at least 1,000 miles from the nearest sea. You go east or you go west. Your mountains you've got just to the north. Himalayas are very close, right? But no ocean for 1,000 miles. Yeah. The siting of the power station on the coast because of the necessity of high quantities of water for cooling purposes, right? But the rather stupid idea of putting the backup power units facing the sea. It's the most likely direction from which danger would have come. So, of course, that's partly why, as you know, the power station began to go into meltdown, was that all power was lost. The backup units didn't work because they were destroyed themselves by the tsunami, okay? And for some time, it was impossible to find alternative sources of power. There is a concept in energy studies which is called distributed power, which is the idea that you can switch power sources quickly from one location to another. If one place is lacking power, then power can be drawn from other areas quickly. Fukushima case, that doesn't seem, what they call TEPCO, was it the Tokyo Electric Power Company that owns and runs the plant, had no mechanism for distributed power. So if power was out, it took considerable time to reconnect to the main grid inland and begin to provide an alternative source of power, okay? Corporate control of energy, right? TEPCO being a very good example of that. And also the question of corporations in general. There have been far more nuclear problems in Japan than you know about because the power corporations don't tell you. There have been lots, and every now and again something leaks out that there was an accident somewhere, but they keep this very quiet because I read an example of this morning. Actually, yesterday's paper, which I bought yesterday, and I was reading this morning, somewhere in Yamaguchi-ken, apparently there's a shortage of doctors. Doctors don't want to work up there. Okay, too cold, too snowy or something, okay, whatever it is, right? That one town has taken over a little museum that was built by the local nuclear power company as a showroom to persuade people how safe nuclear power was, how it works, and this kind of stuff. But there are practically no visitors. Before 2011, apparently there were quite a lot of people went to see the displays and to see the, how it all works and all right. And after 2011, the number dropped very, very steeply. So last year, only 5,000 people went the whole year to look at the museum. So the town have actually taken over this company, this building, and turning it into a clinic. They've hired a doctor. And they're going to convert it into a clinic. The power company were a bit upset about this. On the one hand, they thought, well, it's a good use of the building to turn it into a clinic. On the other hand, they were very unhappy by the fact that people didn't want to know about nuclear energy. Could see declining interest because of fear of, indeed, the dangers and the unsolved problems of getting rid of spent fuel. There are many parts of the world, India is a very good example of this, where increasingly communities themselves are running their own power systems or controlling their own power systems, which means it's not in the hands of large companies who are making the big decisions about who gets power, pricing, and this kind of stuff. So the corporate dimension is, we can talk about that if you want to anytime. Lack of warning, evacuation plans, and something you can't blame emergency services for. I mean, in the case of a major disaster, it's very hard even for firemen or ambulance crews and so on. How do you get places? There's damage, streets are inaccessible, stuff all over the place, right? So you can't particularly blame them. But it does have something to do with the location of emergency services, where they are in relation to access routes to probable sites of a disaster. Okay, and the post-disaster resettlement issue again with some parallels with the Aceh case, but differences as well. We mentioned this in class last time, right? That one of the lessons learned from the great Kobe earthquake was to resettle people together. After the Kobe, people were just distributed anywhere, right? Particularly elderly people could have been sent to, I don't know where, miles away, sent to Chiba or sent to who knows where, right? They don't know anybody, they don't know the neighborhood, they had no support group, there was no family nearby, so levels of stress very high. One of the lessons learned was after the Fukushima one, when you resettle people, as far as possible, resettle them in their natural groups, the same village, same community, keep kinship networks together, because then you have the support mechanisms in place, okay? And they're very valuable, obviously. Revival of the local economy. Now, 2011 probably seems a long time ago to you guys, right? But I remember being there at that time and talking to, for example, I was talking to a strawberry farmer in Fukushima, okay? He said, before the disaster, it's one of those places where it's rather a nice arrangement. If you've ever been to those places, you pick your own strawberries, but you can eat them at the same time. So finally you fill your basket, that's the ones you pay for, but depending how hungry you are, you can fill yourself up with lots of strawberries before you actually go and pay for the ones you've put in the basket, right? He said 90% decline in people coming, 90% decline. And there were places in Tokyo, there were I don't know if it happened anywhere where you lived at that time. You'd see signs with produce, and it's rather ambiguous. Sometimes it would say Fukushima produce. Now the idea was you encourage people to buy it to help the revival of the local economy. The problem was there were some people who wouldn't buy it because they were sure that their tomatoes or whatever were full of radiation, right? So it was rather ambiguous policy. Should you label it as coming from that neighborhood? The idea was positive, was in fact to begin revival of the local economy as far as possible. And I certainly knew people who would deliberately buy produce from Fukushima because they wanted to support the revival of the economy. Okay, this is very important. Without revival of the local economy, of course, communities don't really come back, right? The importance of networks, again, the use of the military, including actually in the Fukushima case, the US Navy actually did something useful from Yokosuka, or wherever they have their base. They sent ships up the coast to provide resources, whatever. So they can be useful sometimes, right? But also a culture of mutual support. In post-disaster situations in some places, there isn't such a network. So what happens is things like looting. Shops are damaged, nobody there, or empty houses are abandoned, right? The occupants have gone. So what do? You go and steal the stuff, right? I didn't hear of any case of that here, as far as I know, right? There's no culture of looting. There's no culture of, taking stuff that's not yours. There is a culture of mutual support, of sharing, okay? Plus the fact that certainly after 2011, trauma counseling was made available to people who, quite understandably, had all sorts of psychiatric issues, deriving from the trauma and the loss of home, or the fact they couldn't go back to their home, and all this kind of stuff. So you see a lot of parallel factors here, right? So far, so good. Anything you'd like to discuss with the... Many parallels, of course, right? The physical basis of the disaster was similar, right? Okay, Haiti 2010, again, there was a very major earthquake which caused a very large number of casualties. And the factors there seem to be pro and con. Again, where we're trying to draw out the major factors here were several. Very poor building standards. Buildings were not really designed to withstand anything more than a minor shock. This can also be related to corruption. There was a very tragic case. I lived in Singapore a long time ago, and there was a case on one Saturday morning, a small hotel in the so-called Little India part of Singapore, where in fact a lot of Indians live, collapsed. Had a bank on the ground floor, but the upper floors were the hotel, right? Killing lots and lots of people. It turned out that after investigation, that the builder was cheating, and some of your engineers, right? what percentage of sand has to be mixed with concrete for it to be secure? In fact, what they done was they added far too much sand. In fact, some of that sand was beach sand. It was damp and it contained salt and all sorts of stuff. So in fact, the quality of the concrete was very bad, all right? And for several years, of course, the building had stood there. I don't know what it was that occasioned on that tragic morning, the collapse of the building. It just like fell in on itself, right? That cheating on building standards is not uncommon in lots of the developing world. India, you see lots and lots of cases of this, where substandard materials are used, fake reporting of quality. You use far less steel than you were supposed to use, but you report that I did, but nobody checks, so nobody knows, right? A very poor country, extensive levels of poverty, meaning in many cases that, in fact, even if people wanted to build strong dwellings, for example, they wouldn't have the resources, yeah? And they would build on top of each other. You quite often see this in India as well. A building is licensed to be a 2 or 3 story building. And there's a 4th story, a 5th story, a 6th story. People just added things on top of a structure which is not designed for more than 3 stories. And the fact they're illegal, but again, because of the culture of the kind of legal and regulatory infrastructure, people get away with this all the time until there's a problem. Of course, there's a disaster. Mumbai, we were talking about the floods, but Mumbai's also had, in the last year, there were 2 or 3 cases, again, of apartment blocks collapsing. And they were quite old, but it turns out always, when they were investigated, was, of course, that the physical structure of the building was totally inadequate for the load that it was actually carrying, partly because people had added illegal floors above the officially permitted level. The good news was that there was very rapid international response, including from Japan. The emergency response brigade was sent from Japan almost immediately. So within days, there was great problems. People were arriving, not knowing quite what to do, but in terms of searching for victims. In fact, actually in Singapore, there was an interesting case of this with the collapse of that hotel. It was during the period when Singapore was building its subway system. It so happened that in the city at that moment were a lot of engineers who specialized in subways. And they knew how to tunnel, okay? Because if with the collapsed building, of course, you can take stuff off the top with cranes, but in many cases people were trapped inside. They had the technology actually for burrowing into the rubble of the building. Quite a lot of people were saved simply because there were those subway engineers happened to be in town at that time because of the underground train network was being constructed at the time. Good luck. But of course, with rapid response is extremely important because of the fact of things like dehydration. I mean, how long can you survive buried under a building, alive, but without any source of water or food? And it's a hot place, okay? Whether being hot or being cold is worse, I'm not sure under those circumstances. But rapid response is very important. Aid was quickly found from international donors, UN and major NGOs. The geographical location. Haiti is half of a bigger island, which the Dominican Republic is the other half. Okay, the island's divided basically into 2 countries. All right, which meant that in fact there were resources close by that could be transferred fairly quickly by road, by other means, okay? And again, religion turned out to be important, not only because of people's religious beliefs, but because there were strong religious institutions, okay, which act actually as kind of NGOs, right? And had already a network in place of charity work, of working with elderly people, working in kindergartens, working in all sorts of stuff. So they had an infrastructure that was basically based on the network of the Catholic Church in the case of Haiti. So again, we find religion is one of the cultural dimensions of this. Okay, storm-related factors. the great Hurricane Katrina, which flooded large areas of New Orleans. Now, poor sea defenses here really were a factor because a lot of New Orleans is below sea level. As occurs in other parts of the world, parts of the Netherlands, you go to Holland, quite large areas of the Netherlands are actually below sea level, but the sea defenses are very good. And for the most part, they have never been breached. I don't think there have been serious flooding from sea getting in, as far as I know. Okay, but if your city is below sea level, a lot of your cities below sea level, you better have good defenses, right? Which it turns out that in fact the federal government, the US government, had reduced subsidies for sea defenses. There was, in principle, a budget to do this, and it hadn't been. It was cut back. So it's not bad. The levees, they're called, the seawalls, are not bad. So you really want to spend all this money on reinforcing them. And of course, in the event of a superstorm, the impact was far greater than the existing, rather old defenses could manage. And with the increase in the number of superstorms in the Caribbean, maybe here too, this is something to really think about, particularly if your city is vulnerable. Other factors had to do with the sociology of the situation, not the nature of the storm itself, but its impact. Most of the badly affected areas were poor districts, and ethnically, they were mostly African American districts. Okay, the very affluent parts of the city had better defenses, right? Were on higher ground, right? People had ways of getting out of the area, like a car, if they could see the situation was getting very, very bad. The poorer areas were extremely vulnerable because they were poor, right? They were not well defended. People didn't have transport. People, didn't have necessarily the kind of, places they could go, other parts of the US, relatives in unaffected areas, for example. So a whole lot of social factors to do with the social structure of the city, right? Other parts of New Orleans, of course, are fairly affluent, and many of them were flooded, but were not seriously damaged, okay? But part of the reaction to that, we were talking a little bit about culture in a very literal sense, was that it's a culturally very rich city. In fact, it's one of the homelands of jazz, right? New Orleans, right? It's really that deep South culture, right? Great cultural resilience. As people could begin to make music, could begin to make all sorts of things out of the disaster, turn it not into fun, but at least reacting to it with a sense of humor, right? A more sort of creative way of dealing with it rather than seeing it as a disaster in a purely negative sense, right? That it was possible to respond. And other creative responses, which were very notable in New Orleans. In the poorer areas of the town, many of the houses are wooden, okay? Badly damaged in the flooding, could not be reconstructed out of the same material. A movement began in New Orleans to deconstruct the old wooden houses, obviously with the permission of their owners, to either build a new house somewhere else, or to create other things like furniture, wooden benches, chairs, tables, and so on, out of the wood from the seriously damaged houses that could not be rebuilt in the original place. So kind of recycling of materials proved to be very, very important, partly because in a poor community, people are not likely to have the resources to rebuild. Make sense? I can't afford it, right? I mean, my house was destroyed, right? What do? We take down the old one, dry out the wood and so on, and you can reassemble something else with a little help from creative local architects in particular to put together a dwelling which is quite adequate and doesn't really cost you anything. It's a recycled model insofar as you can. So that's another interesting way of responding to damage. If you've been following the news now, the last week or two, Australia, of course, had these unprecedentedly huge fires. particularly in New South Wales, in the southeast corner of the threatening the capital, Canberra, suburbs of Sydney, the major cities, destroying huge areas of forest and wildlife that lives there, right? And now, yesterday or the day before, it started to rain, and now they have floods, right? Which have put out the fires, but are causing, another problem, right? Which is even worse. Can you imagine? First of all, your place is burning, and now it's kind of underwater, right? Now, many of the people begin to analyze this, have looked for the factors that are behind this. It's a very developed country. It's not a poor country, far from it. It's a very affluent country, right? Okay. And there are some of the factors. First of all, the effects of climate change. Australia is already a very dry continent. In fact, most of it's dry. The central part is really the edge, the coastal areas which are inhabited. Inland, there's almost nothing. It's extremely arid. It's desert or semi-desert, right? Remember flying across Australia once. If you're going from Sydney to Singapore, it takes about 8 hours, 6 hours. You're crossing desert. You look out of the window of the plane, all you see is just desert for 6 hours. What's that? 3,000 miles or something. Very, very dry continent. Okay. But the drought, the particular drought which seems to have particularly triggered these fires, is itself a result of long-term climate changes. Okay, exacerbated by two things. I was reading again something in the newspaper. Yes, it's good to read the newspaper, by the way. You find all sorts of interesting things. That apparently energy companies have had a really bad time this winter because it's been warm. I don't know, was it warm here until recently? Europe was warm, apparently in Scandinavia, people walking around in t-shirts in Sweden, and it's normally like 10, 12 degrees below freezing, but they've had a very warm summer. Energy companies very unhappy because they can't sell fuel and natural gas for heating. And this article was pointing out that, from the point of view of climate change activists, this is a really good thing. So, well, you guys complaining. You caused the global warming, and now you're complaining that you can't sell fossil fuel, right? Like, too bad, you caused the problem. And now, it's got warmer. Nobody wants your stuff, So, right? In a way, the climate strikes back in a way. Okay, but this has been exacerbated in Australia because it's still a very heavily coal-dominated energy society. Okay, both in terms of its usage and as an export. In fact, one of Australia's major exports is coal to China. Okay, major export business. They also export uranium for nuclear power generation to other countries. Okay, other factors too, right? Very dispersed settlement patterns. Again, if you look at the not completely desert, but semi-desert areas of Australia, there are huge ranches with cattle, sheep, right? And in fact, it used to be the case that it comes for children. If you live on one of those stations, you either have to go to school and live somewhere. You have to go to a boarding school, or in fact, I think it still exists in Australia. There is a TV and radio network, so isolated children can actually follow school lessons because they live so far from any urban center that there's no way to commute to a school, okay, unless they go and live in a city or town somewhere, okay? So with very dispersed settlement, of course, the risk factor is in some ways lighter because you're more spread out. But in terms of risk, it's also higher. You have no neighbors, you have no immediate resources that you can call on, or very few, because of the huge distances separating settlements from one another, sometimes even by air, okay? Very large distances. And a number of things that have come out recently were that much of the firefighting of these fires was done by volunteer fire brigades. They're not professionals, right? Which is fantastic. It's dangerous, yeah? But they're not really trained very well. So they don't necessarily know what to do or even how to guard themselves against danger, right? You don't just squirt the flames with, fires behave in very unpredictable and dangerous ways. They can leap. You'll be fighting a fire in front of you, discover a fire has occurred behind you, right? You're trapped because you hadn't figured out the pattern of fire spread. Okay, things like this. So, without adequate training, you have very noble people fighting the fire, but the question is, do they really know what to do? Do they have the equipment to fight fires of this size, right? Slow response by leading politicians. The Prime Minister of Australia, to a lot of political trouble. He was having a vacation in Hawaii when the fires broke out, and he didn't want to come home. And after about 3 days, we said, you have to come back. This is becoming a major crisis. Got huge criticism. He should have got on the next plane back to Australia, right? He waited like 3 days before he did anything, right? And it's been very, very slow. Not only the Prime Minister, maybe other politicians. And this is partly to do with that Australia is very relaxed kind of people. And one of the phrases you often hear if you go to Australia was this phrase, you have to say in Australian accent, you say, oh, she'll be right. Oh, it's a flood, never mind, she'll be right. It'll go away, nothing really to worry about. And this time that didn't work. Right? It wasn't right, right? It was really wrong, okay? But the cultural attitude was, you'll be relaxed, it'll pass quickly. You get fires every year, they're never very serious, right? Till it turns into a huge problem, all right? And again, the long-term effects of that will be, so Australia, interesting question of this, all right? Now, there are many other examples. What I try to draw your attention to is if you look at any particular example, how can we mine it for insights, okay? And here are a few more. I mean, there are lots. In India, in Gujarat, there was a large earthquake in 2001. And in the very northernmost part of India, Kashmir, there was a similar earthquake, illustrating some of the points we already talked about, including bad building standards, lack of any kind of emergency response teams, right? Distances, and the one in Kashmir, it occurred during the winter, which meant many of the valleys are in deep snow. So access for relief teams is very, very difficult, except by air, right? And that's difficult for other reasons when it's snowing and this kind of stuff. Right, last week there was a superstorm that hit Europe, including UK, badly, huge amount of damage done by a major storm. Flights cancelled, trains stopped, and heavy trucks blown over on the freeways. That's bad. If trucks get blown over, it's kind of windy, okay? You get storms in the winter. The Amazon was also having huge fires several months ago. You may have seen on the news as well. And the current Prime Minister, President, of Brazil doesn't seem to care. So this is okay. It's just forest, right? It's just a lot of trees, right? If it all burns down, then farmers can move in and grow stuff, right? Extremely short-sighted approach to this. And I was rather annoyed because a few days before I left India to come here was Indian Republic Day, the day when there's a public holiday to celebrate the Indian Constitution. Okay, and the Prime Minister, the President of Brazil, was the guest of honor of the Indian Prime Minister. I'm not very fond of either, but Mr. Modi, who shares a similar kind of attitude. Never mind the forest burns, it's just a lot of trees, right? Never mind the carbon sink and other factors, but plenty of examples. So what are the broad factors that we can think of that we should then include in our kind of total model? One is very much politics. Okay, in the Brazilian case, in the Australian case, this was this question of we don't really care until it becomes very, very serious, right? Lack of response. And in fact, at the time of the New Orleans disaster, it's very hard to verify this, okay? So it's not a matter of fact. A lot of people suggested that one of the reasons why response was slow was because it was a poor Afro-American city, right? If it happened in an affluent white city, that would have been quite different. The army would have shown up, everybody would have shown up in 5 minutes, but in New Orleans, well, it didn't matter so much because they're only poor African, people of African descent anyway, so not so important. A lot of people said that. I mean, it's hard to verify whether that was strictly true. Possibly it was, okay? The politicians didn't intervene as fast as they would have done in a different kind of community. So there is almost always a political dimension to the way in which disaster response occurs or is structured, what kind of resources are put into rebuilding, okay? A natural disaster creates humanitarian crisis as well. And later on we'll look at those parallels, because one of the obvious parallels is with refugee communities. And the way in which refugees, often political refugees, try to reestablish, their own sense of community, sense of meaning. Okay, so we'll look at that. Economy, I missed out an H. Both local and international, meaning the example we talked about in Aceh, reestablishing the fishing industry was the traditional form of economy, all right? But also the effects of international economy on things. One of the major sources of foreign exchange in Sri Lanka, and the coastal areas particularly, is tourism. Okay? Now with the coronavirus, I'm finding many, many interesting dimensions. And let's really hope it doesn't spread here. These poor people are still stuck on their cruise liner in Yokohama Harbor, right? Is the way people are reacting to this. And I've read a number of things. I do tend to read the newspaper every day, okay? Where, for example, a lot of business people, economic specialists from the big securities companies simply say, oh dear, this is going to affect the world economy, oh dear, it's bad. Growth will slow, right? And again, I think climate activists say that's a good thing, all right? If China doesn't produce quite as much in the next months, that will actually probably positively impact CO2 emissions and this kind of stuff for very sad reasons, but nevertheless, it will have. But they're talking about it largely in terms of, oh dear, this is going to affect us. Airlines have canceled flights to Chinese destinations and so on, right? And this kind of stuff. They're losing revenue, right? The problem is, oh dear, we're losing money. People are dying, that's sad, but we're losing money, right? That's really sad, right? Okay. And so, there's always something going, there's a very close relationship between structure of international economy and the way in which responses to, in this case, disaster. So in the Sri Lankan case, of course, part of the issues was how to rebuild the tourist infrastructure, right? And how to persuade people that it's safe to go back, okay? Japan suffered a huge decline in tourist arrivals after the Fukushima disaster. It dropped considerably. It's now grown back, okay? Because I think people have again decided that it's fairly safe to go to Japan now. You're not going to get radiated too much. Maybe stay away from Fukushima, but anywhere else, Kyoto or somewhere is fine, Tokyo is fine, whatever, okay, that it's coming back. You have to persuade people that it's safe to return, all right? This won't happen again, or it's not likely to happen again, so you will be safe. So that is often where the international economy has considerable impact on post-disaster recovery patterns. Do they put resources in? Or do they see this as an unsafe place which should be avoided? Okay. Attachment to place and memory, social memory. We've talked about that today already, of course. The fact that there is a deep psychological connection to place. And because of that connection to place, being displaced from a space with which you're familiar is itself a kind of trauma. It's a very unpleasant experience to have to go through. You cannot go back to the place. We mentioned the island of Montserrat on Monday, right? Which was 2/3 of the island was basically destroyed by a volcanic eruption. So in many cases, for many of the islanders, they go back, they can't find their home. You know, it's buried under piles of volcanic lava, right? They will still go back to the location that used to be here. You know, my house was here, right? You can't find it anymore. It's obviously totally, physically, totally destroyed, but this was the place, all right? So there is that very strong thing to do with this. Now, again, I came across an interesting example, again, something I read recently. Read lots, it's good for you, was that Mr. Trump is building this wall along the border with Mexico and the United States, trying to keep presumably Latin Americans out, right, of the United States, right? A very interesting issue just emerged in the last couple of days. Somewhere where the construction is going on is disrupting traditional burial grounds of the Native Americans who originally lived there. Okay? Now, for many people, that's really, really a bad thing. You know, maybe I have to move or something because of your dam or your freeway or your whatever, your new airport or something, okay? But don't disturb my ancestral burial grounds. They're really sacred, right? The whole tribal memory is tied up with these kind of lands. So this is going to be interesting to see how this is resolved. You're going to make the wall go around these things. So, you know, my burial ground is left untouched, right? Something similar has actually happened in Australia with the Aboriginal people, with mining, coal mining and uranium mining is often on traditional tribal land, which means either disturbance of burial places or just disturbance of memory places, okay? I don't know if you know anything about Australian Aboriginal culture. How do I put it? Materially, it's very simple culture. The boomerang, you know, the boomerang and this kind of thing. There's very little technology for traditional Aboriginals, right? But their knowledge of landscape is incredibly intimate. Every rock, you know, every piece of the landscape has some story. But there's a concept in Aboriginal thinking, it's called the dream time. So when you're navigating across the desert, the way you would do it would be say, well, you know, keep going until you come to the rock that looks like a kangaroo, right? And keep that on your left and keep going until you come to such and such a place, which is the dingo place, right? After the dingo, keep going until you come to somewhere. So, you know, the whole landscape is mapped in terms of mythology. If that landscape is disturbed by mining, for example, the basis of that knowledge is disrupted. Right? You can't navigate anymore because somebody's dug up, you know, the land. The landmarks have gone, right? They've disappeared. It may seem a minor example, but I think it reflects very strongly this question of attachment, okay, and how people deal with that under circumstances when they are violently disrupted, displaced from, you know, their place of origin. There's the other issues we've also talked about a little bit today, right? The adequacy of formal and informal emergency response services. Now, I am told that after the Great Kobe earthquake, the government was very slow, okay? It was very slow. It turned out that somewhere in the political structure in Japan, the army, the Minister of War, whatever he's called, Minister of Defense probably, right? I'm sure not war, defense. Couldn't mobilize the army until he got permission from someone who had to ask the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister was playing golf or something, and, you know, it took hours or days before the army could be mobilized. That the most effective, immediate first response unit in Kobe was the Yakuza. Okay? So organized crime turned out to be quite useful under those circumstances because, you know, they knew people, they had networks of their own kind, originally based on criminal reasons, but in emergency situation, they turned out to be very effective. They knew where people lived, they knew where there were elderly people, they knew all sorts of things, and they had a resource base, okay? So in the 2 or 3 days before the army showed up, it is claimed that it was the Yakuza was one of the first response organizations that began to get stuff together to, help victims search for people buried in rubble of collapsed houses and so on. Okay, so that's an example, obviously, of an informal emergency thing. It could be something else. It could be a religious group. It could be kinship networks. It could be all sorts of things. Okay, depending on the specific local culture. All right, and the final one, or at least the final one to think about today, is cultural resilience and social cohesion. That is to say that when a community has fairly tight bonds, resilience tends to be stronger, which is fairly obvious in a way. As I say, I was learned from the experience of the Kobe earthquake, don't disperse people away from their networks of contact, okay? Elderly people particularly suffered very badly from this because they found themselves in a social environment they didn't know anybody. And if you're very elderly, it's probably harder to make friends. You're not quite so outgoing physically or psychologically, right? Really, really suffered from being displaced. They had a place to go. They were provided with housing and so on, but they didn't know anybody, okay? This was a bad idea. So that social cohesion turns out to be very important in maintaining cultural resilience. So, and as we've seen in a couple of these cases, is religion. For two reasons, right? Number one, religious organizations often provide exactly a case of an informal emergency response, right? There are networks of schools, hospitals, kindergartens, all sorts of things in place already, right? Which can be realigned to meet the needs of the disaster rather than their original function. If you have kindergartens, you have space, for example. You know where the children live. You know all sorts of things. You know who their parents are. You have all sorts of ways of responding effectively to a disaster. If a child is missing or a parent is missing or whatever, you know the address. You have all sorts of things which the government agencies may or may not have, depending on the country. In some cases, they would have very inadequate knowledge of the details of a local community. Okay, so you have the informal emergency response, and you also have this question about meaning. Remember, we talked about this a little bit last week. We were talking about narratives. There's a famous medical psychologist at Harvard University, a man called Arthur Kleinman, who's written a very famous book called The Illness Narratives. And in that book, remember we talked about this a little bit on Monday, he talks about the fact that for sick people, it's not simply a question of knowing about the technical things. What drug should I take? What is the prognosis? Can you operate and stuff like this? They have to create a story which makes sense of their illness. Why am I ill? Why did this happen? What does it mean? How am I going to respond to this? And people have pointed out that in disaster situations, it's exactly the same situation. Ideally, you need to create a story about what's happening, what you can do with this, how you can create something out of this experience, okay? And it turns out that it's often religion that gives you the vocabulary with which to do that. It's God's will. This can be positive or negative. For example, when AIDS began to appear as a major scourge, there were right-wing Christians in the United States who were saying, you see, this is God's punishment for gay people. You see, you're not supposed to do this now. You guys are all getting sick, and it's your fault. You see, so it's a kind of a good thing. And we say, no. So, but that was a kind of negative narrative. All right, the disaster happened to you because you were up to something evil, right? But the positive ones are, of course, that they do help people create a framework of meaning through which they can begin to make sense. Whether you agree with that model of meaning is another issue. If it makes sense to them, it provides them with a very powerful tool to adapt to the circumstances that they find themselves in, even quite extreme ones, right? How are we doing for time? I think we're just about right on time. I'll give you just one little story to give you an example of this. It wasn't a disaster, but it was something sad. A colleague of mine passed away from cancer, and we all went to the funeral. quite naturally, and all dressed up as you do in Japan, in a black suit, ladies in a black dress, a black tie, and all this kind of stuff. When we got there to the funeral, we discovered everybody was wearing bright colors. It turned out this gentleman was a member of it's a kind of semi-Christian group called Jehovah's Witnesses, which are a kind of sect, okay? Their theory was that it was sad he died, of course, because, his wife would miss him, children would miss him, and those guys' friends would miss him, but he'd gone to heaven. So why come in black, come in pink, come in red? He's happy, he's in a beautiful place. So whether or not you agree with that theology is not particularly the point. The point was, from their point of view, this was not a tragedy. It was a kind of promotion to, a better place, right, than the one you'd come from. So you can see why in a disaster situation you could find exactly that same kind of logic operating. So religion turns out to be one of the most important cultural elements, I think, in which people respond to this kind of situation. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Sorry, we, as usual, run out of time more or less, but I think that's the last slide anyway. I hope it is. Is that the last one? Oh, yes, it was the last one anyway. So, yes, please.
In the Fukushima case,
yes,
you mentioned many things because of the earthquake. Many things was polluted by the nuclear radius.
Yes.
So, for the safety reason, how should people deal with those polluted things? For the safety reason, how the government, how the people, how the human to deal with those polluted, such as the water.
You mean the basic resources?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's how do we put it? I mean, you've obviously got at least two aspects of this. One is that, particularly a natural disaster, you can never be totally prepared to be able to mobilize resources. The ideal is probably not to stockpile resources. I mean, you have some huge warehouses all over the country full of water and, I don't know what, cup noodles or something, right, that last fairly long. Is to have networks through which resources can be mobilized quickly to be delivered. We talked about distributed energy as an example of that. I think the same logic would also apply to other resources, water, food. If it's in winter, then obviously blankets, tents, whatever. That's much cheaper too. What you need to do is create the network, not to create stockpiles. You probably want some stuff, but then you don't have to plan for something which may never happen. It's expensive to maintain large stocks of stuff. So I think the network approach is probably effective, and I think maybe that is something that was learned from the Fukushima example. I hope it was, at least, yeah. Very good then. So thank you. So see you Monday. It's Monday again, right? Monday. Next week, Monday, Wednesday, I think we're on the same schedule for the next week or two. So have a nice weekend. It's only Thursday, right? But weekend is coming soon, right? Okay, thank you so much.